Hey everybody, welcome to Future Whenua Yarns. I'm Zeb.
And Rob. So we're on episode 4. Getting into the swing of things. Any day now we're going to be topping the charts. But this time we are speaking with
Shane Ward from Action Ecology. And this is another one. Shane spoke at the summit, sent in a 5-minute video, and it was awesome. Really inspired some good conversation. And so it was awesome to get back in touch with Shane and just talk about this whole topic from his perspective, which is a really good one. He is a brilliant communicator, so he can piece together these big ideas in a way that's quite easy to follow. And I think what underlines a lot of it is this shift in our story, a shift in our perception, where we think of ourselves outside of nature, outside of the loop, and in a natural system, the output of one feeds into the input of another, and it's very circular in that way. And when we think of ourselves as outside of that, it skews the circle, and that's what influences some of the stuff that's going on with our wider ecology.
Well, I think, that speaks to a bigger challenge that I think we're seeing across, society, to give it that word, is that separation from nature. That we believe we are this special object that is somehow unique, that we are not, at the behest of nature, that we're not, a product of nature. So I think that gives us that strange perception that we can treat ourselves as divorced from this system, yet all the evidence is showing that actually we're so integrated. The Japanese practice of forest bathing that's actually having genuine clinical benefits to people going out in nature. There's all of these signs that show we're part of this system. And I think, I haven't watched the whole thing yet. I'm looking forward to it. But I really enjoyed Shane's introduction where he does talk about this way of, the term I sort of came up with and I think works is societal triage. Where, it's thinking about if you were to arrive as an outsider on the scene of humanity, of the planet, how would you view the most important tasks to undertake first? And that's a similar sort of process to medical triage, where you look at who has what injury and, and you decide who best to help first based on the access to information you have, based on the tools you have at hand. So I think that's a brilliant way of starting to think about these problems. It's not just we have a problem with the environment, let's fix it with technology, but really to take that big step back and sort of look at the whole system and, figure out what the right solutions are. Very, very permaculture.
And the amount of stuff trying to yearn for our attention and distract us this way or that way. If we took this societal triage approach, it's a good way of just why is what we're talking about important, I suppose, is what that sums down to.
So stop watching the news is what you're saying.
Yeah, I wouldn't watch it.
Yeah, because, that is in essence what it's there doing, is it's constantly changing the biggest concern. It was COVID, then it was Ukraine, then it was this, then it was that, there's always there's always a new thing to drive your attention towards, them, because, hey, there's a financial benefit to that. Their advertisers get, a good reward from keeping your attention on that screen. But it is really that case of taking a big step back and looking at the whole system and figuring out, what is doing what. And you might realize that actually the media, the news, all these kinds of things that are keeping you, distracted are there for a reason. They're there to stop you taking these big actions and, and actually solving these big problems, because I think there are systems in place that have a vested interest in keeping things as they currently are.
Yeah.
Going off on a bit of a tangent.
All sorts of ways you could go there. But one thing's for sure, it is very important that we do start to heal this separation and start to rethink of our position within nature, not outside of it. And guys like Shane are just really good at expressing that point and sort of taking us through a different way of viewing all of that. So I hope you enjoy, firstly, his presentation and then the yarn that we've had just recently.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's basically the pre-interview done. As per usual, like, subscribe, comment, all the usual things. And any day now will be the biggest podcast in the world. So, yeah, enjoy the interview with Shane and Zeb, and we will see you guys next time.
See you all.
Kia ora. My name's Shane Ward, and I'm an agroecologist, regenerative land use advisor, and the founder of Action Ecology. This short video is an introduction to my work and what I think are the most important things we need to be focusing our attention and energy on. We are the first generation to know that we are destroying the biosphere's capacity to support human societies, and the last that can do anything meaningful about it. That's a huge responsibility that we have to future generations, but maybe also the most exciting of times to be alive, because what we do and the choices we make really count. In light of this, I founded Action Ecology to help do my bit and become part of the most important work I believe humanity has ever had to undertake. Our relationship to the landscape has always been the most important thing for both our survival and our ability to thrive, whether we remain aware of that fact or not. Because everything we have and everything we want is derived from the living biological system that nurtures us with air, water, food, and the materials to write our dreams and ideas onto the landscape. Therefore, the story that we tell ourselves about who we are in relation to the living world around us is the most important one to get right. And we have a long track record of getting it wrong, so this is not an easy thing to do. Action Ecology is therefore focused on connecting the science, practice, and people of agroecological land use, or regenerative agriculture, or sustainable land use and living, however you prefer to describe it. Helping people rewrite that story, recasting themselves as caretakers of the land, both for now and future generations, by striving to better understand the systems at work and harness nature's powerful force to live in order to improve the health and well-being of both landscape and people. The work that I'm engaged in covers a lot of ground, but I guess the two main pillars of it are the design and planning of diverse agroecological land use systems, and providing advice to help people transition towards management of landscape that is driven by the ability of biological systems to regenerate rather than synthetic inputs and novel chemistry. I think both the design and management are equally important. One provides the what and the other the how. A key part of rewriting this story and moving towards a system that operates within ecological limits is building resilience into our landscapes and our livelihoods. And like in nature, we achieve this through diversity. Diversified land use is the prerequisite for a permanent food system, without which we cannot have a permanent civilization. So the trail that we must blaze today to diversify our business models to accommodate this, even against the prevailing economic winds, is of vital importance. We are all stakeholders in this food system, and if we want a future worth having, we need to get this stuff right and support each other doing it. And for those of us with soil under our fingernails, we need to understand, and I think never lose sight of, a fundamental truth, which is that we're not farmers or orchardists or homesteaders or gardeners. We are ecosystem managers, whether we realise it or not. We are stewards, we are caretakers, and we are partners with the living world around us. So on that, I'll leave you with a final thought. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. Thank you.
Shane, awesome to be connected with you again, man. Thanks for coming on.
Pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, and thank you again for this talk at Future Whenua Summit. It was 5 minutes of just punchy, set the scene for why this is important, and yeah, we sort of watched that and then had a conversation as a group, and there was a really good set of flowing ideas through the group. So cheers for instigating that.
No, my pleasure.
Nice. Yeah, these are critical times. Globally, there's a lot of stuff's heating up, and the rural sector is the foundation of our society. So I just want to I'll leave you with something pretty open. Why are these important times, and why is the rural sector answerable to some of the, way that we're going to steer this around?
Yeah, I mean, big topic, right? Look, at the end of the day, human society, or civilization as some people like to call it, the end of the day, it's all dependent upon air, water, food, preferably clean, for all three. So, everything else, our economies, our societies, our cities, everything, literally everything is dependent upon having access to those things. And so rightfully, there's a lot of talk at the moment about ecological overshoot, and how do we design our societies to operate within the ecological boundaries, the carrying capacity of the planet, and the value of what have been termed ecosystem services and natural capital and all this thing, which is of course a way of trying to take economic language to sort of wrap around environmental ideas in order to, I suppose, get through to people whose only interest is sort of economic, or they're economically minded people. So, and all that's really important because clearly, if we get that wrong and we place the needs of, shall we say, the more abstract things, which we have invented, human economies and all these things, these are just ideas that we have about how we should trade and relate with each other. And we put those things before the actual, I suppose, hard realities of our planet, then there's only one way that's going to end. So, there's obviously a lot of talk, particularly in the environmental movement, about what do we do about that, and increasingly in economics as well all around the world. And more people are starting to realise that the effects of making poor decisions on that are already starting to bite us. So, and of course the effects are not just environmental. So, a lot of the symptoms are environmental, and we're familiar with a lot of that stuff, and climate change, biodiversity loss are super important. But a lot of the causes are economic, they're societal, they're decisions that we make about how we run things, taking the really, really big view here. So, but the problem is, I think, is we get the priorities wrong. We sort of don't do the exercise that I think is important, is going back to first principles and understanding, what's effectively real, what is something that exists whether we're here or not, and what are the layers of things which we then put on top of it, which are effectively more abstract, right? They only exist in human minds, such as economies and societies and all these other things, which are important, but they're not necessarily as important, I wouldn't argue, as the ability for us to have clean air and water and food and so forth. So we need to get those other things right first. We need to have societies, economies, communities that can operate within the natural ecological boundaries. We need to understand what they are. And then once we do that, we need to understand how to work within them. And so at the core of all of this, when you sort of go through all that process, and I'm obviously speeding through all this stuff, but when you get through to the end of that, towards the other side of that journey, the questions of, well, what do we do, and what are the levers that we have to pull, we come to our land use and our patterns of land use, which clearly brings us to agriculture in all its many forms. So not as the only thing, of course, but as a really critical piece of this puzzle. The idea of how we choose to design and manage our land use patterns is really critical. The relationship that we have, I suppose in a way, the frame of view, the mental frame that we have for what the land is and what it means to us. Is it a resource to be exploited? Is it a piece of property? Is it, what is it to us? What is land? And of course, every culture has its own history of attitudes towards it and philosophies about it. And some of those have changed over time. Some of them have a more ancestral or traditional relationship, often healthier, and others don't. And I would say that the dominant globalized perspective at the moment is very much an extractive industrial one. And at the end of the day, what that does is that sort of alienates us, as living organisms, as a community, as a society of living beings. We lose our, shall we say, we lose the healthy perspective on our connection to the living world that supports us. And I'm choosing my words kind of carefully here because I'm trying to not make a philosophical point. Although it is a philosophical point, I'm actually trying to make a point that's a very practical one. Because you can definitely have a philosophical discussion about this, and I think it's very valuable. But what I'm actually pointing at here is something way more I suppose, practical and pragmatic, that it is a scientific reality that we are dependent upon these systems. We have been pretending for a rather long time that we are not, and that we've treated them in a different way, and that has had consequences. So what I'm trying to do is reframe the discussion to say, regardless of what your philosophical perspective may be, or your spiritual frame of reference, that's all great, but that's not even relevant, because actually what we need to do is actually refocus back onto what's critically important for our survival, and then beyond that, how we can also thrive. And recognizing that the key to us as humans thriving on this planet is through helping all the other species thrive as well, and that we can't do it alone. We arose because they were there, because we were part of something larger, a biologically, ecologically rich system. And if we lose that ecologically rich system, we will also suffer, if not become extinct ourselves eventually. So that our fate is tied with the health of our species is tied to the health of the living planet, which we depend upon. And that's ultimately the point here. So when we talk about things like natural capital and ecosystem services, the interesting point that I think kind of gets maybe glossed over a little bit in that conversation is, so even in scientific and academic circles, it is well understood the value that these things have. But maybe sort of somewhere along the line in the discussion, I rarely hear anyone point out that the majority of the people who are stewards, the guardians of these ecosystem services, are farmers. They are the people in rural landscapes. So they matter, and they matter for a load of different reasons. But, again, from this big picture perspective first, they matter because while now more than, I think it was sometime in the 90s, that more than half the world's population started to live in urban environments for the first time in human civilization, human history, that now we have less than half the population effectively managing or being responsible for safeguarding something which all of us are critically reliant upon. But at the same time, we have developed a system where we have put the people that are running, trying to have livelihoods off the land, are put into increasingly more dire circumstances, and we are asking them to operate within an economic paradigm which is squeezing them and often forcing them to make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make, or prioritise things that they wouldn't otherwise prioritise. So this brings us back to why we need to be having really important conversations about agriculture, about rural land use, about the kinds of patterns that we as humans are trying to put onto the landscape, and ask whether that is the appropriate thing to do in the first place. And there's a whole discussion around the history of why that is, but the fact is that we are where we are, and we need to start making better decisions. And until we get to the point where we can fundamentally shift, I guess, the economic pressures or currents which are pushing us along in certain directions, which we definitely need to do, because none of those are viable long term anyway. But in the meantime, while we're doing that, we need to start somewhere today. We need to do something right now about the kinds of enterprises that we have, the way that we're managing those. And that's not straightforward. It's not easy, but it's very, very important.
That's fantastically put, man. I feel like we could just say goodbye now, and that sort of encapsulates the primary message. If we could really dig into what you've just said, that's all there. So awesome. And I absolutely feel this tension between ecology and economy. It comes up in researching and having the high level conversations I've been having, and then just right down to on farm. I'm constantly clashing with my old man, who's still the farm manager here and still has the checkbook. So I would like to split every paddock on our farm in half and cut it with a diverse hedgerow so we can sort of start getting natives and pollinators and all sorts of things in there. But to do that fencing, to do that planting, that's a huge outlay. And where does that money come from, and how does it get paid off? And just like nearly every farm in New Zealand, I'd say we're understaffed, and I think we should have more people, and that would allow us to put more attention on ecosystem services, be more attentive to stewardship than just our profitable sheep enterprise. But in the end of the day, Dad's got this sort of, let's call it boomer mindset of economy above all else, and so that's what drives our decision matrix. It comes down to, is this going to be profitable? And it's just, I don't know how to step out of that. It doesn't, the bank account, that number, it is ethereal, it's imaginary. I don't think the bank, the risk is the bank comes and takes our land or something. But other than that, it's like having more trees brings more birds. My future, the future is more, I'm driven towards that future much more than a number in a bank account. But yeah, that tension exists by just all the momentum that's come from Dad's history and everything that surrounds the whole farming sector.
So it's a really common story. I mean, in my work, dealing with farmers, landowners, this tension, of course, is central to everything. I think one of the approaches that we often try and take, or strategies we try and use, is to say, well, we recognise that there is this kind of this dominant economic current is often a good one, that can sometimes pull you under, but it's a huge sort of pressure to do things in a certain way that exists, and we can't, as individuals, today when we're having a conversation, change that. Can't click our fingers. However, we can potentially be a force that shifts that current, or that engages other people, inspires them to think about, changing it all.
Who's the we when you say that we can do that?
Well, when I say we, I guess I mean, as a sector, we have an opportunity, but and which is, I think, what we're kind of seeing in this sort of regenerative agriculture space, is we're starting to see the development of a movement of a critical mass, which will have an effect, that will create changes, and what those changes are, and what the scale of those changes are, how big an effect we see, is kind of up to us in a way, and how we do it. But what I find interesting is the conversations, that's where we always have to start. When I'm having conversations with people that I'm working with, we always have to start there. And so quite commonly, I guess, if we were just talking about, say, transitioning a farm from an industrial management approach, dairy or sheep and beef or whatever it may be, to more regenerative approach, we sort of say, okay, well, what's your fertilizer budget, for example? Let's see if we can just operate within that existing budget, so it doesn't cost anything else. And let's see if we can just shift things across so that you start to have positive ecological impact without spending any more. And then what we'll tend to find is that we'll become more profitable doing that. So we're starting to cut cost out. Sometimes production drops, sometimes it stays the same, sometimes it goes up. It just depends a bit on to what degree is the operation being artificially pumped up with synthetic fossil fuel inputs, and various other things. But I've yet to see an example where anything's gotten worse. It's always either been the same and more profitable, or even better than before. And so that's sort of a great place to start, I think, in kind of year one. And then we start to find that the landscape responds. We become more resilient as an operation. We are more profitable, which gives us a slightly different position from which to start making different decisions. So we are no longer maybe in a scarcity mentality where we're saying, okay, we'll have to give something up now. You become a bit more in an abundance mentality where you can see, and again, I'm sort of condensing a journey, right? And everyone's particular journey, of course, is slightly different because they all start in a different place, different contexts, and so forth. But nevertheless, if I was to kind of summarize it, with that they've kind of they've made some changes, they've seen how it works, they feel more confident with what they're working with, the sort of levers, if you will, that they've got to pull, the areas where they can influence are much more familiar to them now. And then what sort of happens is that they, pretty much everyone I've spoken with or met with, that in this space that's kind of gotten to this point where they're kind of comfortable with managing their system in this sort of regenerative way, has had, I think, a very similar sort of realization that the next stage, that it's not enough to just go from being, say, a conventional, I don't like that word, but conventional, say, dairy farmer to a regenerative dairy farmer. That's not the end. That's not the end state. That's not the end goal, job done, tick in the box, wipe your hands. No. Once they get to that point, they then realize that actually this is just step one in seeing the land for all of its potential, that trees, nature, the flow of water, the role of all the living things that are happening are all important and all offer something up in terms of an economic potential, right, in terms of other enterprises, and that really the ideal, the optimal land use pattern isn't a monoculture of just dairy or sheep and beef or pine or avocados or kiwi fruit or whatever, right? And that this is some weird idea that's, been sort of imposed, right? And that's the way that the sector is organised, but it's kind of ecologically illiterate. It's sort of irrelevant to the land. Doesn't care whether we think like that or not. The land is always trying to sort of regenerate and become more diverse, and we sort of try and stop that at our peril. So once we start to embrace it, even if it's just to start with in one sort of sphere, like dairy or whatever we're doing, we begin to see the benefits of doing that, and that starts to open up other doors. And then we run into other challenges. It's not straightforward, but to me, that's the really exciting work as well, is that how do we do that? How do we get more people back, into rural areas? How do we revitalise these communities again and start getting services and thriving community life back into some of these areas that have been sort of siphoned off over the last couple of generations into the cities for opportunities and, satisfying lives, most of which, of course, the cities are full of people that don't have satisfying lives and are yearning to some way back. But, that's a whole other conversation about, ownership structures and the finance of, and how do you, blah, blah, blah. But from a sort of going back to the sort of ecological side of it, the land is capable, as you're aware, of being so productive, so abundant. And sometimes we just need to take up sort of boot off the neck of it a bit to sort of see it bounce back. And then that provides us with opportunities, and how we sort of grasp those opportunities and what we do and how we structure the economic side of it is a really valuable question, an important discussion to have. And I'm involved in that myself at the moment with a few of my clients. And because we're at that point now where we're like, well, we have been designing and talking about all kinds of really interesting mixed land use models, but we're still operating within this kind of very industrial economies of scale paradigm where everything's, for the people that sort of proponents of that system, the dream farm is a dead flat, large scale farm with machinery and one farmer, or even better, no farmer at all. It's all just satellite guided, and everything. Like that's the techno utopia for farming. It's all done by robots and drones and GPS and whatever, and you can take all the people out of it. And it's all, just all inputs and outputs, and, you can put it all on a spreadsheet. But of course, anyone who's actually worked on the land, kind of should realise how preposterous that whole notion is. But that's effectively what the industry has been pushing for 70 or 80 years. That's the kind of logical conclusion of their model of what they want. Whereas, of course, we're talking about something very different, putting people back onto the land, people having meaningful livelihoods, doing things, having a connection to their landscape and caring about it and being able to pass it on to future generations in a state that's better than it was before. And so, but answering the sort of challenge of, well, how do you sort of fit that square peg into the round hole of of this marketplace that we're kind of interfaced with. Well, that's an interesting one. And there are some, some great stuff that's being done in that space. It's embryonic, but it's all happening. And it's happening around the world. I think, everyone's facing a similar sort of challenge to a different degree. But that's an exciting piece of work. And I think, the key in a way to what the answer is, like what do we do? How do we make this better? What's the sort of the direction we need to be? What's the compass bearing we need? And to me, I think it's that we know that from an ecological perspective, from a land use perspective, we need to embrace and encourage the diversity. And then what we do about that, how we harness that to have livelihoods and provide for ourselves and our families and our communities is up to us to work that out.
Mm. Yeah, there's a lot in there as well. I think there would be happier lives if people were getting back to the land, and there is a lot of unhappiness in society, and I think that is part of this. We've disconnected ourselves, removed humanity from the rest of nature, and we are a part of this big whole system, and it's probably that separation that's just left us with a bit of this gap. And I think it's one of the most crying shames of what's going on right now is like we're having this huge big party, using up all the resources and the cheap, and then like not even enjoying it, or still having this. It's like, if we're gonna have the party and we're gonna like use everything up, or it just thrive in it, don't. So. Yeah, I don't know what would come in a future that might not be so energy abundant, or you can just get minerals from anywhere in the world to right here.
And this is the point, right? This is the thing which kind of still blows my mind a bit, is that for whatever reason, we can't seem to wrap our heads around the fact that the only future that we have available to us is a low energy one. And like there is no saving all of this globalized world that we've built with mega cities and this future of flying cars and all. It's nonsense. It's not possible. There simply isn't the energy for it. And even if there was, which there isn't, but even if there was, it would destroy us, because at the moment our economy, the globalized economy and the model that we have, has been built and is dependent upon abundant energy, right? Because it allows us to do things, to do work, to employ that energy to do things that we can't do with just our hands or oxen or whatever, right? So this kind of one-off fossil fuel inheritance that we got, we've done amazing things with. Like, it's pretty impressive, what we've managed to achieve with this, but we've forgotten that it's a one-off, that it's limited, that once it's gone, it's gone. Because I guess it's happened over several generations that we've just become accustomed to it. We think that's normal. And at least in the developed world, I guess, we think that's normal. And we have a sort of calibrated our expectations accordingly. We've literally built our dreams on this expectation that the future will be some better version of the present, with, of course, not counting the cost. And then even those that do acknowledge the costs to the planet, and that's not even getting into the whole kind of like how it's been distributed, income inequality and all that jazz. But even just looking at the environmental impacts of it, even the people that kind of acknowledge that still, I think, fundamentally cling to this idea that we can just swap out technologies. We can swap cars, fossil fuel cars for electric cars. We can find some internet app, or I don't know, robots or something, some technology will come along and save us, and we can sort of continue as we are, living the way that we do, consuming the way that we do. But it's not physically possible. It's not that I'm saying I think it's bad or that I'm judging it. I mean, I do think it's bad and I do judge it, but it's not the reason why. The reason why is because it's limited, right? It's just, there's simply only so much sand in the world to make concrete. That's becoming a crisis now. There's literally only so much material you can dig up out of the ground. And once that's gone, it's gone. It's used. And some of it can be recycled, and some of it even more of it could potentially be recycled. And let's hope we work that out. But at the moment, we basically just dig a big hole in the ground and shove it all in there and then burn more fossil fuels to make more stuff to sell to people so they can just dump it in a hole. And that's really just how everything kind of works. And it doesn't take a genius to realize that someday that's going to end. That's not actually something you can do forever. And if you can't do it forever, then you've got to work out what you're going to do afterwards. And so this is really, to me, the only common sense conversation to have about any of this stuff, which then, of course, leads us back to, what is viable long term? What is, truly sustainable? What is it that can be sustained forever, effectively, indefinitely? Well, it's only stuff which is renewable. Basically, at the end of the day, we have a planet, and the only energy input into it is the sun. That's it. Sun comes in, plants, algae, etc., convert solar energy to chemical energy, and everything else runs off that. That's it. Even the fossil fuels is just dead stuff that did that a while ago. So really, we kind of need, I feel like we need to, again, go back to first principles and design something a lot better than what we've got. We have a solar-powered planet, and we have this amazing thing called photosynthesis, and that drives everything else, all of our agriculture, all of our food, all of our oxygen. Well, not all of our oxygen, most of it actually, if you count the algae in the sea, which does about more than half of it. It all comes from that, right? The climatic patterns, weather systems, it's all kind of this one beautiful, amazingly complex and elegant system. And we're kind of a bit like spoiled brats going around trashing the place. And ultimately, if we want to sort of work out what we're going to do about it, well, I feel like we kind of need to just get real, like just sort of accept the reality of the situation that we're in, where our energy comes from, and using that as a way to sort of build something that makes more sense, right?
Yeah. We live on a planet with finite resources, and we live in an economic system that is based on infinite growth. And it's like that fundamental equation is a big disalignment, and it doesn't make sense. And I don't know why it's taken so long at the top, because there's been orators telling this for a long time. It gets rehashed. Kate Raworth and Donut Economics really spread the word about this really, really well. But it doesn't seem to be influencing policy. And I wonder why is, like, at a government level, they seem very happy to jump on the carbon chain and talk about the carbon cycle and greenhouse gases, but they're very resistant to talking about degrowth. So we can bring this carbon accounting framework that we know, but to talk about something like replacing how we measure prosperity, that doesn't seem to be part of the equation. Maybe it is, and you might have an example of that being a case somewhere. But like, what's the resistance to that different way of thinking?
Well, I mean, that's a whole huge conversation in itself. The why don't we see change? And, there's a spectrum of views on that. And depending upon what mood I'm in, I'm sort of somewhere, the cynical end or the optimistic end. But, at the end of the day, it's people, right? We're dealing with people. People are complicated. Individuals can be smart. As a group, we tend to be quite thick. People as a group often make some reason that they're not very bright, but individuals can be. But also people are flawed. People have bad days. People are influenced by things, by their feelings of self-worth, by feelings of belonging, by ideas about all kinds of stuff. And so when you start putting that into, mixing that with power and influence and politics, and it just becomes a real mess. But I mean, putting that to one side, I guess, at the end of the day, the system that we have tends to give power to the people. Depends which chicken and egg. The people who often have the most power to change it are the people who are benefiting from it the most. So it's not really in many people's interest, direct self-interest, to change it. So, and then, of course, at the end of what I think, though, is that maybe the bigger question or the bigger trend is whose job is it to think long term? If you think about the timescales at which people are making decisions, certainly in Western society, at the end of the day, governments 3 to 4 year election cycles. There's no votes in massive disruption. So, politicians sort of famously lead from the rear. They will take leadership, but only when there's already votes in it. So there has to already be a bit of a mass there for them to kind of step up and walk to the front of the mob that's already formed, if you will. But yeah, I mean, who else? So companies like large corporations, it's yearly really is the horizon on which they think. Some will have a medium-term plan, which to them is 5 years, but even that's pretty vague. Most organisations won't have anything solid across a 5-year time horizon. Most are watching the market. So whose job is it? I mean, at the end of the day, the exception to this, the only one I've come across is insurance companies, and particularly reinsurers who employ actuaries, whose job it is to forecast way out decades in advance to look at trends and try and understand, what's happening, what's coming at us, what can we insure, what's economic to insure or not, and so on and so forth. So out of all the jobs that I've come across, they're the only ones that I've ever really found whose job it is to think long term. Most of us aren't incentivized to do that. And so we have what we have, right? That's the sort of the result of that, of people not thinking long term. I think maybe when perhaps our societies were more focused on ancestral, or had a more ancestral view and more intergenerational view, which a lot of traditional societies do, things that was probably a bit better, in certain regards, certainly in relation to the resources and the planet. I remember hearing about a Native American society who would always ask, how would this decision affect the seventh generation? And I feel like we need a lot more of that. But at the moment, we don't. So we make decisions based on short term, and at the moment, it's not in anyone's short term interest to really bring about fundamental change. So the people that are doing it because they are either A, long-term thinkers, and or B, they are driven by their values. They see the problem, they believe strongly that it's important to do something about it, and so that they're pushing back. But they don't tend to be the people who win a popular vote or anything like that. So, or become the leaders of large, international organisations that wield billions of dollars to change things. And then, of course, the ones who are the billionaires at the 0.00001%. Well, I mean, they just want to fly into space and basically just ride the planet into a fiery crashing heap and have a great time on the way down, as far as I can tell. I don't know, I don't speak for them, but I don't hold out much hope. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I listen to people like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and they, out of the lot of them, those are the two which strike me as being the slightly more intelligent ones. Again, having not met any of them, but from what they say. But even those two, I think particularly those two, it's very concerning to me how ecologically ignorant they are. They seem to, from my perspective, to have no real understanding of biological systems. They are technical people, they're engineers, they are mechanistic thinkers. Technology interests them, and so their view of the world and our future and what we should be is very much driven by this, what I see as the dominant paradigm. To them, success is everything is automated and efficient, and we go to Mars and we live this amazing space fantasy. Which A, of course, there's no evidence that could work even if we did have the energy, and B, frankly, I don't know why we would deserve another planet when we can't even look after this one. So.
Yeah, I think they could definitely do with some time spent with the First Nations people or Indigenous, because there does seem to be a unifying belief of Aboriginal people around the world is just this seven generational thinking, whakapapa. There's like, and also this interconnectedness that we are one. And then, because of just the Western globalization, that didn't come alongside with those values. So those values have been, suppressed everywhere. Do you know the book Ministry for the Future?
Oh, I don't.
It's a sort of fiction story. Highly recommend getting a copy and reading it. It's by Kim Stanley Robertson, and it's sort of it opens up, and it's maybe 10 years in the future, and it's in India, and there's this huge heat wave, and it's wet bulb temperatures of 35 degrees plus, which humans can't handle because you can't sweat in a wet bulb environment, and so there's millions of casualties from this one heat wave, and then so the Indian government sort of goes rogue and does this biosphere thing, and then they set up this ministry for the future. So it's their job task to think, but of course they're like a UN agency, so they're confined by the same restraints as the general political system. But then there's these sort of like vigilante assassins that are just knocking off oil execs, and it's a great story. I'm about halfway through it, and I'm just like completely engaged.
Environmentalist wish fulfillment. That sounds pretty good.
No, that's a good one.
I mean, look, so when we sort of talk about, because everyone asks, well, what can we do? Right. And I think it's a valuable question, of course, because it's all well and good to sort of identify all the problems. And, well, I will actually say a lot of people, I do over the last few years hear a lot of people say we don't need to talk about the problems anymore. We know all about them. It's depressing and it demotivates people, which I think is rubbish. Frankly, I think it's so urgent and important that we shouldn't really be talking about anything else. If people feel a bit demotivated, I perfectly understand. But at the same time, I think we all just need to grow up a bit and face the mess we've made and not sort of feel sorry for ourselves too much, but just crack on and start doing something positive about it. So I do think it's really valuable to talk about what's gone wrong and try to understand why, so that we can learn from that and do better. Then it is important to talk about what we can do. It's important to understand where the limits of our own action are too, so that we can focus our attention, our dialogue, our calls to engage other people in applying focus to areas where we as individuals can't, but as a collective we can, make change. I think that's really important too. But again, remember what we can do. And I think that by, talking is powerful. Speech, communication, engaging people is a powerful thing. We need to, I think, ensure that we recognise the value that the decisions we make on the land, what that brings to the rest of society, how important that is, that it's not farming versus environment, that it's farming because environment. And that I think there's a lot of people in the cities who have a very shall we say, black and white or one-dimensional view of farming as a whole. And I think that it can be quite unfair, but it's not necessarily incorrect in the sense that the things that they hear about in terms of the impacts of farming on the environment are true. It's not that those impacts aren't real, they are. But what's missing is a nuanced conversation as to why and how. And, it's not as black and white as, well, farming's hurting the environment, therefore farming's bad, therefore we should all just grow all our food in a lab. I mean, that is the most absurd line of reasoning I've come across. It's obviously way more nuanced than that. And, of course, how we use the land, the decisions that we make about how we design and manage our systems is critical. I think there needs to be an increased awareness that those that are on the land as stewards are vital to our society. They should be recognised and I think supported and celebrated way more than they are. And I think, of course, those that are callously harming the land for their own personal profit, I think that should be ended. I think that we could change the way the system works so as to harshly disincentivise that kind of behaviour, but I don't think that that's the majority of people. In my view, the majority of people that are on the land, working the land, care deeply about it and have a strong connection to it and want to see it better. And, many of them, I think, just deserve way more support in many different forms. In some cases, that can be economic, but often it can be in terms of just, advice and guidance and just moral support even. I think, we have become so atomized and disconnected that, at the end of the day, society, that, the way that the economic system essentially is built is to say, well, everyone needs to specialize. The most efficient thing is for everyone to specialize. So everyone has their one cog, and you do that thing really, really well. And you don't need to worry about anybody else. So you're a farmer. You just do that. You just produce, say, milk solids. That's your job. Produce as many milk solids as you can, as efficiently as you can, and then you're winning. And then you over there, you do this other thing. You don't talk to each other. You don't need to understand anything about what each other's doing because you're all just cogs in a big machine. And that's effectively how it works. You're supposed to be one thing. And you should be good at just one thing. And there's this notion that you can't be good at anything else and that you shouldn't try. And therefore, and we see it everywhere, right? At the end of the day, and it gets wrapped up in people's identity. Well, who are you? I'm a dairy farmer. Well, are you? I mean, that might be what you do, but is that who you are? And I think that this notion that we should be taking these kinds of things and making them our identity is a bit troubling. Because it can have some negative impacts and side effects, and it can make us resistant to hearing new ideas because it challenges that identity. It becomes personal. And I've lived through this myself in other ways, so I know what that's like. And I think it's not helpful. And also because I'm always trying to say to people, you're not a dairy farmer, or an orchardist or a gardener. You're an ecosystem manager, whether you realize it or not, because that's what's out there. That's the reality. Like actually out there, regardless of what you think about it, if you walk away, it's still there. It's still an ecosystem. The fact is that what you do is when you turn up in the morning, you just see a dairy farm and you just think about it as a dairy farm because that's what you've been taught and that's what you've been told. That's the story that you've been put into, right, and that you've adopted as your story. But that's not the limit. That's not the limit of them as a person. That's not the limit of what's possible. That's just a story that they're telling themselves. And it's a story of their relationship with the landscape. And this brings us back to the kind of traditional societies, which I think is really interesting because, so I don't know a great deal about Indigenous Australian culture, but the bits that I do know suggest to me that there is this extremely deep not just connection to landscape, but this idea of narrative, of that the story of the land and the story of the people are intertwined. They're not separate. And that, I've heard, information about how that, that some of the ways that they navigate and the way that they, do it through storytelling and through narrative and understanding the relationship between different sort of the character of the landscape and their history. And to me, this is, fascinating and really rich. And there's a lot we can learn from it. Because I think ultimately as humans, we have evolved to be highly social creatures. And the key way that we make sense of anything in the world is through narrative. We cast ourselves as characters in a story, our own story. Our relationship to the world around us, the people that are in it, the land itself, we tell stories, and I think a key tool that we need to embrace for moving forwards is to change that story, to recast ourselves within this narrative, to change the story that we're trying to tell, to ask why. Why is the purpose of my existence to optimize myself as an economic entity, to what's the term? I can't, just gone blank. In capitalism, you're an economic actor, and the idea is to maximize your
GDP.
Yeah, or your utility. Your or whatever it is. Yeah, but like, what is that really? What it's all for? Like, is that what we're doing all this for? Like, and anyway, it's a whole bigger question. But to me, it's a powerful thing, and I think it's relevant because it's not just a big question, because it's actually a small thing too. Because when some of the people that I'm working with, when they get up every day and they're excited to get out there into the paddocks and see what's happened and respond to it, they have changed their story. They have changed their relationship with their land. They have changed who they are in relation to it, and what the land is in relation to them. And what's the role that, maybe if they're livestock farmers, what's the role the animals play in that story? So, and this is interesting to me, like, so sometimes I'll have a conversation about, well, how do we manage this paddock here? Okay, well, maybe we've done something, maybe we've put in a cover crop, or we've, changed the pasture diversity, and we're talking about, well, how might we change the management as a result of that? Well, actually, now what we're doing is we're not managing the paddock and the grass in order to feed the animal, in order to get an economic return. What we're doing is we're using the animal as a tool to improve the health of the grass and to optimize photosynthesis, to build soil and improve resilience. And as a result, a side effect, if you will, a positive benefit of doing that is we'll have healthier animals and we'll have more of an economic benefit. But you see how by shifting the emphasis and changing the story that we're telling about the landscape, we have changed the way that we relate to it. We've changed the actions, and in some ways, I think that's one of the key things that I offer with people that I work with, that I sort of help them with, is help them see their landscape as a living ecosystem, and how different decisions and different ways of looking at things, or how you set things up, changes the result. It changes the way that the landscape functions, and can give them, it can work to their benefit or to their detriment. And often it's perfectly understandable. It happens to all of us that if you don't have fresh eyes and you're just used to seeing it a particular way, it can be very difficult to see it any other way. So the amount of times I have someone say to me, "Oh, I never sort of really thought about it like that. It's just always been like that." It's amazing. So yeah. So to me, it's this idea of narrative, this story of like, who are we? What is our relationship to the land?
Yeah, just I couldn't resonate more with that. It is so fundamental to making the shift, is changing the story. And it's also one of the things that gives me the most hope, because I see the story changing. I hear people telling a different story, and sometimes it can be a dark story that's getting told, but underlying is this message of a change here, individually from landowner to land steward. I think people are, and not just changing that word, but reflecting, actually giving some consideration. If I change that title, well, what does that mean? It's a change in what your outcomes you're seeking. It comes from that. And if you change what outcomes you're seeking, that's going to change the decisions you make and the practices you do. And then at this collective level, if we change from humanity, the masters of the world, to humanity, a big player and part of a huge ecosystem that we have to support because of the size of our influence, then yeah, I think that change of the narrative collectively is got, that's where a lot of my hope lies. And yeah, especially people getting back to the land. I see hope there as well. It's funny because some of these things are needs that we can see, ecological needs, and then some of these things are just getting driven by the way that the world's shaping around. It's like people have just been locked up in their apartment buildings. They're realizing, wow, being on the land would have been awesome during those few months. And so I think there's an awakened spark into this return to the land. And yeah, and then it gets back to the question about like what was the driving force that's, you mentioned it earlier, that sort of industry leads people to less people on the land, more in the cities, and yeah, I'm the same. Sometimes I'm more optimistic, some pessimistic on how I'm viewing this, and like, is this a big Agenda 2030 sort of thing, and the global ruling elite are trying to get us into cities so they can keep an eye on us, or is it just a function of the way the market is set up?
Well, I think personally, I kind of feel it's the latter. I mean, over the years, and in my experience, and I've had previous careers working in the corporate world in London and various things, and had exposure to lots of different sectors. I've kind of come to the conclusion that, generally speaking, sort of conspiracy theories don't make a lot of sense. People, it's very hard to keep a secret, especially in this world, in this day and age. And people being people, you'd be amazed how much of what goes on kind of sometimes is just incompetence and happenstance. And miscommunication, and it's kind of, some of it's a bit of a comedy of errors. There are definitely people, and there are definitely groups, all over the world who have agendas and who are very determined to achieve them. But nothing ever goes to plan, good or bad, I find. And so I'm not suggesting that, it's all just chaos. It's not. And you do need to be, guarded against groups who, and most of them are actually quite, the crazier they are, the more crazed or passionate they are about achieving their goals, usually the louder and more obvious they are. But the way, this sort of thing about is anyone sort of at the wheel? I'm not really sure that they are. I don't think it would be even possible really for anyone to maintain that sort of. At the end of the day, I kind of think that it's a bit of I take a bit of an ecological view, I suppose, in the sense that when you look at a community of organisms, in an ecosystem, no one's really controlling it, but their own collective needs and wants and, sort of finds its own balance in a way. Like it creates a situation. Well, balance maybe is not quite the right word, because it doesn't always necessarily achieve a balance. Maybe over a long enough time frame it does. But what happens is that, you kind of get the sum total of all the different things all trying to do their own thing, right? And then some will kind of rise and others will fall and vice versa. And then you kind of end up with this sort of what you might call a fluid mosaic, a sort of patchwork of stuff, which is always kind of shifting. It's never still or static, but it kind of holds a particular shape or form. And I think in a way that's kind of what happens with our human societies. Particular groups or ideologies or whatever nations rise and fall. But at the end of the day, the system is such that most people have joined it rather than sort of moved away from it. So, and those that have managed to benefit from it find themselves in a better position to keep it going. And so that's kind of why we end up where we are. I think that, what you then end up finding is that, so for example, if you look at things like urban centralization, there are people who, in what they used to call industrialists and those who town planning and designed energy networks and rail systems and, governments, people that work in sort of large infrastructure, they have this, they had a strong belief that the most efficient way was to centralise, and so when I worked at an energy company in the UK, it was interesting to note how, we started talking about things like energy strategy and what are the pros and cons of centralisation versus distributed energy generation. At the end of the day, if your goal is to provide a return to shareholders and you want to make things as easy as possible to manage, then, and that's it, like you're not looking at anything else necessarily, then it makes sense. Yeah, centralize, have this sort of hub and spoke model where everything you make the power plant is at the center and then you feed out lines to where you need to deliver it to, and you can manage the center bit, and that's kind of becomes your focus, and then you can connect those up, and then you have all these hubs and you make everyone in the city because that's efficient, because then you can have your factories there and they don't have to go as far and then you don't have to spend as much money on transport and so on and so forth, and it compounds, right? And then people come along and they're like, okay, I'm starting my career in this thing, and this is what's already here, I guess I'll work with that, and I'm being told by everyone who's more experienced than me that this is the most efficient way to do it, so okay, that's what I'll do, and so on and so forth. And so I guess where I'm coming from and my point about all this is that we have built assumption upon assumption for generations, and actually I think a lot of the assumptions that underpinned that were false, particularly abundant energy. So when we actually widen the criteria and say, well, actually, yes, we want things to be efficient and we don't want to be wasting energy or anything else. However, the goal is not to provide as many people to work in factories as cheaply and quickly and easily as possible and pay them as little as possible. That's not our goal anymore. Our goal is to actually survive and make sure that we can have a thriving biosphere so that we can have a thriving economy, which is not about growth, because it can't be, but it is about prosperity. And so when you suddenly have those goalposts, then the emphasis shifts. And if you start to then challenge some of the assumptions of, well, should everything be centralized? Should everything be about a whole bunch of motorways all heading into a big city and having people living in suburbs and, having centralized energy and infrastructure and blah, 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 and all that other stuff? Then when you challenge those assumptions, you go, well, actually, maybe not. Maybe that's not the right answer. And so, where do you start? What comes before what? And so my idea, the way that I like to think about this, is to say, well, it actually starts with the land. We need to start there because that's the fundamental thing, that even if we don't have any of that other stuff, we still need clean air, clean water and food and shelter, which comes from the land. So we need to start with the land and ask what's right for the land. And once we kind of work that out and get that sort of roughly right, then the other things flow on from that. But at the moment, we do it the other way. So I suggest that we flip that around and we start with first principles and look at what makes sense for the planet, for the landscape that we're on, the context that we're in geographically and climatically. And then we build up from that. And then when we look at where do people live, in what density, how are they connected via transport, how do we generate energy, and what is the extent to which we need to do all those things, then the answers to those things change. Because if we're not living in cities, and bearing in mind, which might be obvious at this point, but it's worth saying, at the moment, more than half the world's population is critically dependent upon other people providing food for their existence, right? So they've outsourced their food, their survival, to other people. Now, clearly, if we're going to have societies, not suggesting that everyone needs to be a farmer or growing their own food, but we have kind of stretched this to the sort of almost the breaking point, where a lot of people are so divorced from the reality of where their food comes from, how it's produced, what's in it, that all kinds of things can be perpetrated without them even sort of realising, or even realising that it's important at all. I have seen both firsthand and also television programs and stuff in places like the UK and whatever, where children go to school and they don't even know what a vegetable looks like. You see them hold up something and they're like, "What's this?" No idea. Food doesn't come from the ground; it comes from a shop. You show them a cabbage or something, they've got no idea what it is or what to do with it. That's maybe an extreme example, but it's pretty common. I mean, you wouldn't have to go very far in a city to have that experience. And that's clearly that's something's gone wrong there, right? So to me, it's about going back to first principles, as I said before. I think we need to reorganize things. I think we need to actively start building communities again in rural areas, having options for young people, for our kids to want to stay there, to not need to move into a city, and in some ways, like technology has helped us. I'm not anti-technology. I just don't think that it's the answer to everything. It's a tool like anything else. Having internet access in rural areas can be really important. So if people do want to do something which is maybe technology focused, then they can still do that without having to move into the city. Hopefully we can bring back thriving, rural economies and stuff. So, we have butchers, we have local butchers and markets, and, not everything needs to be kind of produced sort of remotely by a farmer one farmer on a tractor, or one farmer out in the middle of nowhere that never speaks to anyone, does anything, just sends their produce off and it goes on a ship or whatever. And everyone's isolated and atomized and, that's not,
Absolutely. Again, very, very rich what you've just covered, Shane. Thanks, man. And the getting people back to the land, rural communities, building the existing ones and enriching them, creating new ones. I've been following this eco village or intentional community movement for years now, because it's a long-term vision of how we can truly steward this land the best. We've got 1,000-acre sheep farm here, and it's just me and Barons. And I've got we could have 20 people here easily, all living, making a wage from the land as far as I can see it. And if not, then they can definitely, there's half of these jobs are digital nomads now. Like my sister lives in Queensland but works in Taupo, and that's more and more common. So why would you live in a city apartment if you're feeling the stress of the last few years when you could do that same job living on a farm by a river, and in the evenings you can get out and do an hour's gardening and pitch in and help out with creating a more vibrant ecosystem.
And I haven't done the maths. I'm sure somebody else has. I just can't think of it off the top of my head. But if you think about it, for every increase in density in a city, there's an increase in the spatial impact in the rural areas, right? To supply that with sanitation and food and power and materials, and so it's just a big sort of black hole. And I've lived in large cities most of my life, really, on and off anyway. And sure, they've got their benefits, but it's not a long-term model. It's not one that's sustainable. And I agree. I think being increasing these opportunities is just so important, because so many people that I know, they want their kids to take over the farm, or they want there to be a future for them there. They want them to have a good future, and I think they would be pleased if the kids thought that future could be, in the area that maybe where they grew up, and that was an option for them. But so many around the world don't see that as an option. They see how much their parents struggle, and they just think, no. I can have a better life doing something else. And I think that's a shame, because clearly for a lot of people, though, and even many who didn't grow up on farms, who maybe grew up their whole lives in cities, but, they really relish that connection with the natural world, and want an opportunity but can't get a foot in the door. Now the kind of price inflation, the speculation and property, rural property prices and stuff, and particularly in New Zealand, it's very high. Land price, it can be impossible for many, and you're sort of coming into this kind of industrial meat grinder sector, really, where the only way to make money is sort of go big, go large or go home, right? With all the resultant impacts. And then, of course, the financial risk. I mean, there's no way that any savvy financial investor would tell someone to, sink millions of dollars into just one thing and cross your fingers and hope that the industry, especially a minimally processed agricultural good, it would be insane. No investor would recommend that. And yet that's what we ask our farmers to do,
and none of this is to be anti-city or anti-centralization. There is an efficiency of centralizing, less project management, and there is a epicness of cities that you can bring stuff together and people are localized, but it's just, we shouldn't be collecting all our eggs into that basket. We need right. Both to be full, to be, to carry.
It's not the answer to everything. Yeah. So, and in a way, this kind of brings me back sort of indirectly to one of the things that I was going to say before, is that when working with farmers, landowners, whoever, one of the things that I find really important is one of the places we start, apart from just the management side of things, is also looking at the infrastructure of the farm or the landscape and saying, let's take full advantage of everything we get for free. So are we storing water? First and foremost, we want to store it in our soil, but after that, does it make sense to have dams, or, how are we interacting with water in this landscape? Are we making the most of it? Are we optimizing it? Are we just sort of relying on pumps out of, bores or groundwater or streams? Or are we actually making most of what's already falling first? Are we making the most of the solar or the wind resource that we have? And, all of this stuff, of course, needs to, you need to test it out and make sure that it's financially viable and all that sort of stuff. But we need to ask the question first. And I think that when you do that, often there are gains to be had. Often there are huge gains to be had. And when you sort of start to tally that up, then when you start to look at, well, where do people live, and what happens in these sort of more rural things, they don't need to necessarily be supplied with a central energy source or centralized water supply, or do you know what I'm saying? So, and the reason why I think we start with the land first is because that might reduce, in fact, it almost always does reduce the height of the bar we need to hit for some of the other things. Whereas in a city, you don't, because everyone's just there. That's where they are. They've got to have it. They've got to have the power. They've got to have the water. They've got to have the transport. You can't, they're just there. You've got to find a way to supply it. So whereas it's a different proposition when you have a distributed sort of situation, So really, at the end of the day, it all comes back down to our relationship with the landscape, I think, and that's where it starts and ends.
Yeah, I'm seeing this thing like the future of the whenua starts with the whenua or something like this. We should start to wrap this up. I've got 1,000 tutors to dig. I just wanted a little bit of a maybe rundown of Better Futures Forum, what it is or what it was, and maybe anything specific that came out of that was exciting.
Yeah, well, so that was an initiative that launched, I guess, in response to the first COVID lockdown. And it was a group of people who, got together and we sort of wanted to seize that moment to sort of say, okay, like we had this kind of unprecedented interruption of service for the world, basically. And now we have this opportunity to maybe reimagine something better and say, well, we're going to have to restart. So, but what do we just restart what we had before, or do we move forward better and stronger than we went into this thing? And we thought that it would be a great opportunity to put our heads together and engage with people and across all society, anyone who's interested, and weave together a kind of a roadmap for, some ideas for how we could move forwards and get people engaged with that. And that's that was the impetus for it. That's how it all sort of came together. And but then, I think that there was it doesn't really sort of exist, not really anymore. It kind of fizzled out a bit, unfortunately. And I think it was just the challenges of trying to act quickly enough with, there was no money behind it. It was just literally all just people, passionate people coming together to try and make a difference. And I think, a lot of the ideas and a lot of the work that, lives on with many of us who were involved with it in our own projects. And, many of us are still in touch with each other. But as a kind of as something which coalesced and we hoped would sort of move forwards, it kind of went for a little while, but then eventually it kind of just sort of faded away because, things sort of went back to normal in New Zealand, largely for a relative period of time there. And, everyone sort of got busy and it was tricky to find the resource and the time to kind of really, from everyone involved to kind of get it going. It's the same challenge that I think any group of individuals faces. It's extremely challenging to bring disparate individuals. We had great skill sets and great minds and enthusiasm all brought together and stuff, but trying to sort of manage that. And, many of us also have families and just trying to kind of negotiate all of that and juggle it, I think was very difficult. And of course, trying to remain independent. We didn't want necessarily to be funded by somebody else or anything like that to continue the work, because then that might compromise what it was about. But that's what it was. That was the impulse, I guess, the creative impulse of it was to sort of seize that moment to ask those questions, to say, look what happens when we hit pause, and the streets can be reclaimed by children again instead of cars. And, we take a moment. Everything's not just about paying the mortgage or working or whatever it is. And actually, maybe we can ask some bigger questions and take this opportunity to have conversations and look at, doing things better. And I think that the legacy of it is that hopefully, at least for the people that were involved, it should be that we had the chance to have those conversations, and that, once you've had that, you can't unhave it. So hopefully it'll grow, organically from that experience and stuff,
Yeah, it was zero shame in a discontinuation, and just massive props to having crack. And I'm sure there were a heap of learnings and a heap of seeds planted as a result of that. I know I found some content that I would have never found through what you shared on the book. Yeah, and then maybe if you could just finish with Action Ecology. I love the name of your business. It's so good. Action Ecology. It's right there in the name. And of course, we've just talked about so much of the mindset and the stories that underpin it in the last hour. But I would say, for anyone listening, get onto your YouTube channel, because you are just so well versed in expressing this new story and all the things that underpin it. So there's just an amazing amount of content on there. So do get onto the Action Ecology YouTube channel if you're listening to this. But beyond that, if there's anything you'd like to wrap up Action Ecology, what's your service? And yeah,
sure, yeah. Well, look, I mean, by all means, check out the YouTube channel. I'm not as prolific as I could or should be, perhaps. But when I do have video content, I do put it up there, or even audio content. My website, actionecology.com, by all means, go and check that out. The journal section, I post stuff up every so often. I'm not like a big poster. I try and focus on doing the work and, do the media stuff as an add-on to that. But where possible, I do try and share things and hopefully offer some context. Because at the end of the day, I've spent a lot of time, over the years trying to work out, condense, like, what is it what's Action Ecology for? Like, what am I really trying to do? I do lots of stuff, but like, what's it all in service of? And I think the answer that I'm happy with at the moment is it's about connecting the science, the people, and the practice around agroecology, regenerative land use, that topic. And I like that connecting part, and I do that in lots of different ways. And sometimes, it's through the media, through doing little videos and stuff, or giving public talks, or, mostly through working with farmers and people on the ground and connecting them with the people across the world, or just things that we've learned, or, something that someone else has tried, and trialing that and then sharing that. And, that's kind of the main thing. I mean, in terms of the work that I do, it's aside from the public speaking and engagement and the communication, I guess, my day-to-day work, there's two main parts to it. So it's the kind of agroecological design, so design and planning side of stuff, and then the advisory bit. And so I think that they're both equally important. If we're talking about regenerative agriculture or agroecological land use, really sort of seeing the land as a living ecosystem and a biological system, then you need both. Even if you don't formally do a design, or you don't write anything on a bit of paper, you're still designing. You're still looking at that landscape and making decisions about what goes where and function, and what kinds of land use patterns and how they interact, and what that's doing with, where are your trees going, and what about water, and how's that flowing, and where's your access, and where are your fences, and all that sort of stuff. You do it anyway, but for me, it's important to really get that stuff right, because that is the foundation, I think, for sort of really optimal and the sort of the fullest, healthiest landscape function is when you get that stuff right. You're sensitive to your climate, you're sensitive to your water, and when you get it, where you get it, how much of it, where does it go? Is it fueling life, or is it eroding and destroying bits of the landscape? And so that's part of the stewardship is being very sensitive to that stuff. And then of course things like your vegetation and how are you using vegetation and animals and the enterprises and all that kind of stuff, right? So all that planning stuff is one half of it, and the other half is the actual boots on the ground, walking around, advising, talking about things, problem solving, changes in management, tweaking, helping people see their landscape for what it is, an ecosystem, and thinking about how to manage that. So if people want to learn more, they want to know more about me and what I do, then they can go to my website, actionecology.com.
Very cool, man. Well, you are a brilliant communicator, and your intelligence and just understanding of ecosystem function and human system function is very apparent. So it's been an honor to have this yarn with you, and I hope you go and have a brilliant day.
Thanks very much, Zeb. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
You too.